Here we are in the little project office at the University of Buckingham that is the base of a project called Dickens Journals Online. What is Dickens Journals Online? Well, as the name suggests, it's a website. A website containing 30,000 pages of vintage Victorian journalism, edited for the last 20 years of his life by Charles Dickens. Here he serialised his own famous novels and published articles by hundreds of other writers. There's an author biography for every author and an article record classifying it by genre and subject. And this extraordinarily rich archive of information all came from these musty, elderly volumes that I have here sitting on the table in front of me. Here's one of them that we scanned a couple of years back, and it's so frail and fragile now that I daren't untie these binding ties in case the whole book falls apart in my hands. Other volumes have survived a little better, and you should be able to see here, if we can get the camera to zoom in a little bit, here is the very volume that we scanned with the first instalment of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens here on the front page. Now, these biannual volumes, 6 months worth of Victorian journalism, were by no means cheap to buy. They cost 5 shillings and sixpence, which was a lot of money in those days, considerably more than £30. And so one wonders, how could this weekly journal get out to its public? Well, the answer is that it went out in different formats. It came out as a monthly, and the monthlies are very rare, and I'm afraid I don't have any here that I can show. But I do have a copy of a supplement to the main magazine, which was issued just like the main magazine, in this fold-up format. It's like perhaps an Ordnance Survey map or something, and it's, although fragile, it's lasted pretty well for something that is 160 years old. And it would have involved the original purchaser paying only 2p to have a knife, paper knife or an ordinary knife, and slit the top and the bottom and a couple of what were known as forages or front edges to get at the contents. Now, it's all very well to be sitting here in leafy Buckingham talking about websites and looking at elderly volumes and dusty pamphlets. But as these magazines say on their front cover, this is a household narrative of current events. And the reason these journals are important, and the reason these journals were phenomenally successful in their time, is they were all about modern life, what was going on at the time, what was going on at the heart of the metropolis of the British Empire, which of course was London. And in order to really understand how it came to be that for 20 years of his adult life, Dickens was at the helm of these publications, we really need to go to his old stamping ground, the place where he grew up, that formed him as a boy, and where he first started to work, and where he became a young and successful journalist. So, after a short journey, here we are in London. We're just north of the Marylebone Road, and we're going to walk south and talk about one of Dickens's houses. We're now right in the heart of what is modern-day London. But when Dickens was growing up, this was pretty much a greenfield site. It was the new parish of Marylebone, with only a few parish churches. We're just a couple of hundred yards along Marylebone Road from the planetarium and Madame Tussauds. And this is very much a city which remembers Dickens. We're actually standing outside what used to be the London home in which he spent the largest number of years. Number 1 Devonshire Terrace, it was called, and it's opposite the York Gate entrance to Regent's Park, which is just to the north of where I'm standing now. And Dickens lived here for about 12 years, from 1839 through to 1851. And he wrote 6 of his major novels here. But that's not why, for me, it's an iconic spot. For me, it's because this is where he was living when he started his weekly magazine, Household Words. But another thing that fascinates me about this spot is it is very, very close to places where Dickens and his family lived when he was a young boy, when the family were very much less than well off. And we're going to move now, probably only about a quarter of a mile, to the east and a little bit to the south, and we're going to find some meaner streets in the parish of Marylebone, where Dickens lived when he was a young boy and enduring what he would have considered considerable poverty. We've just walked, literally, for about 5 minutes in towards central London and then veered south at Great Portland Street. We're standing now in a street that's called Cleveland Street. But when Dickens was young, it was actually called, at the point where we are standing, Norfolk Street. And we're just across the road from the Greek Pie Company. And this very corner house was one where Dickens and his family lived when they were on the run from creditors in the early 1820s. And one of the most interesting things about this fact is that we are literally only 9 buildings away in Victorian terms from a Victorian workhouse. It was called the Cleveland Street Workhouse, and the historian Dr. Ruth Richardson, who has mounted a campaign recently to save the building from demolition, has proved reasonably conclusively that not only did Dickens live as a young child and also as a young journalist only a few doors away from the Cleveland Street Workhouse, but that it is very likely to have been the building and the institution on which he based the famous workhouse in Oliver Twist. And we're now just less than a stone's throw away from those premises at what used to be 10 and Norfolk Street, and we're just on the borders of Tottenham Court Road. This was the main thoroughfare for anybody walking south, as Dickens did while he lived at 10 Norfolk Street, and during those years when his family were actually imprisoned for debt and held in the Marshalsea prison. His father, John Dickens, wasn't able to pay his bills, and so he had been sent to prison, and the rest of the family, the mother and Dickens's younger brothers and sisters, joined the father there. Dickens himself was sent to work in a small manufactory, what we might call a factory, that made boot blacking, and he was sent to work on Hungerford Stairs, close to the river, tying the tops onto bottles of the product. And he felt this was a great degradation. And he was also left to fend for himself in the evenings and to manage his own money. And so, as he recalled in an autobiographical fragment that he gave to his friend John Forster, later his biographer, he recalled, "I was so young and childish and so little qualified. How could I be otherwise, to undertake the whole charge of my own existence? That in going to Hungerford Stairs of a morning, I could not resist the stale pastry put out at half price on trays at the confectioner's doors in Tottenham Court Road. And I often spent in that the money that I should have kept for my dinner." The familiar sights of Tottenham Court Road looking south. And this would be the site of Dickens's journey south as a young boy on his way down to the river, to the blacking factory where he worked while his parents were in the Marshalsea prison, or indeed as a young reporter living close to this area on his way south to the place that we're now going, the Houses of Parliament. We're continuing south, following Dickens's route to the river, using the underground to help us beat the traffic, and here we are approaching one of his most memorable places of work. Sometime in the late 1820s, Dickens taught himself shorthand, and he learnt it sufficiently well to get a job reporting on the late-night debates in both Houses of Parliament. But they didn't look like this in the early 1830s, they looked more like this, as we see them here in this attractive engraving of the London skyline made around the year 1803. It was here, in the old Houses of Parliament, that Dickens had most of his experiences as a reporter, in cramped, stifling conditions in the gallery, reporting the speeches that surrounded the passage of one of the most controversial pieces of legislation ever passed, the Great Reform Act. Nearly 20 years later, in David Copperfield, Dickens was to record, through the mouthpiece of his narrator, the lasting and negative impression that the British Mother of Parliament made upon him. I have tamed that savage stenographic mystery. I make a respectable income by it. I am in high repute for my accomplishment in all pertaining to the art, and am joined with 11 others in reporting the debates in Parliament for a morning newspaper. Night after night I record predictions that never come to pass, professions that are never fulfilled, explanations that are only meant to mystify. I wallow in words. Britannia, that unfortunate female, is always before me, like a trussed fowl, skewered through and through with office pens, and bound hand and foot with red tape. Nevertheless, cynical about politics as he would become, Dickens was still sufficiently enthusiastic about his job to be, we may imagine, devastated when, one night in 1834, this happened. The old Houses of Parliament were destroyed in a terrible fire, immortalised in this Turner painting. The fire raged through the building after some old medieval tally sticks that no one wanted, kept in a basement, caught light, and nobody could put them out. It would be nearly 20 years before the new buildings, built to the grand neo-Gothic design of Sir Charles Barry, was completed. Meanwhile, the politicians and reporters, Dickens among them, worked in makeshift accommodation, and he continued his nightly walks and journeys through Covent Garden and its surrounding areas, through scenes strongly redolent, we may imagine, of his troubled childhood and adolescence in the city. It's inevitable that in Dickens's many walks as a young reporter, on his way home after reporting those late-night parliamentary debates, it's inevitable that he would have been brought into almost daily, if not weekly, contact with this part of London. Now, we're actually about a stone's throw now from the river. This part of London has changed immeasurably since the building in the middle of the century, the 19th century, of what is known as the Embankment. But in Dickens's day, the Embankment was only just beginning to be built, and when he was working at the blacking factory on Hungerford Stairs, he was actually very close to where we are now. You have to imagine the river banks and the Thames still being a tidal river, subject to the daily flow and flux of the tide, and the muddy banks and a tumble-down warehouse that looks rather like this, in a lovely sketch made by the Bavarian artist George Scharf, who came here to draw and engrave. And behind me you can just about see the arches of one of the city rivers down where the embankment is. And this is probably as close as we're going to get to what is left of Hungerford Stairs. time now to make our way eastwards along one of the busiest thoroughfares in the whole of London, Fleet Street, the home of the press. And we're going to look at some places that have strong associations with Dickens's career as a journalist. Here's Whitefriars Street, and here's Bouverie Street, where he worked and was in fact literary editor for 17 days of a new liberal daily paper established in 1846 called the Daily News. This has always been one of the busier parts of London. We're now in Covent Garden on a street called Wellington Street. And although it has been renumbered since the 19th century, you can probably see just over my right shoulder the blue plaque which commemorates the fact that here is where Charles Dickens finished his long and busy journalistic career, in offices behind me where he edited for 11 years of his life the phenomenally successful and internationally distributed journal All the Year Round. And in this rapid diorama of places in London that we've been visiting today, I hope you've managed to get the impression that London is like what they call a palimpsest, that is to say, a writing tablet over which inscriptions made at different periods of time are overlaid. Because, and I know I keep saying we're only a stone's throw away, but we are literally only a stone's throw away from Somerset House, where John Dickens, Charles Dickens' father, was called up as a naval pay clerk in the early 1820s, and that began the journey down through the ranks of London society, ending up for the family in the Marshalsea prison. And the story we've already heard, Dickens working in the blacking warehouse at the other end of the Strand, very close to here also. And during his life as a magazine editor, one can suspect that Dickens was haunted by these recollections of his past, as he and his sub-editor, William Henry Wills, and their small team of staff writers worked away week in, week out in the offices that you can see up behind me, distributing and commissioning articles and getting their journal out to a readership that was estimated at one point in the 1860s as being upwards of 3 million people.